Support for I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere comes from MX Publishing, with the largest catalog of new Sherlock Holmes books in the world. New novels, biographies, graphic novels, and short story collections about Sherlock Holmes. Find them at mxpublishing.com.
And listeners like you who support us on Patreon or Substack, sign up for exclusive benefits at patreon.com/IHearOfSherlock or IHearOfSherlock.substack.com.
I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, episode 305, That Ghastly Face.
I hear of Sherlock everywhere since you became a astronomer.
In a world where it's always 1895, it's I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, a podcast for devotees of Mr. Sherlock Holmes, the world's first unofficial consulting detective.
I've heard of you before. You're Holmes the meddler, Holmes the busybody, Holmes the Scotland Yard Jack in office.
The game's afoot as we interview authors, editors, creators, and other prominent Sherlockians on various aspects of the great detective in popular culture.
As we go to press, sensational developments have been reported.
So join your hosts, Scott Monty and Bert Wolder, as they talk about what's new in the world of Sherlock Holmes.
You couldn't have come at a better time!
I'm Bill Curtis. This is I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. Now, here are your hosts, Scott Monty and Bert Wolder.
Well, thank you, Bill Curtis, and welcome to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast for Sherlock Holmes devotees where it's always 1895. I'm Scott Monty.
I'm Bert Wolder.
And Bert, you got a lovely vase.
Oh, no, they named that book after me.
I hardly think so.
I was very proud.
No. You probably missed my reference there because I didn't say it accented enough and sounding enough like Dom DeLuise. But that was from a scene in Sherlock Holmes' Smarter Brother. You remember that one?
I remember Sherlock Holmes' Smarter Brother, and I remember Dom DeLuise.
Do you remember who played Professor Moriarty in that?
Oh, sure, Leo McKern.
Yes, and Leo McKern is in the study of the opera singer played by Dom DeLuise, and he grabs a vase off of the mantelpiece and is holding it over his head, ready to smash down on DeLuise's head. And DeLuise turns, and Moriarty tries to play it cool and says,
You got a lovely vase.
And you got a lovely vase!
Carry the one, yeah.
Yes. Oh, so many good outtakes in that film. Not enough to make an entirely good film, but cult-wise, it's fun to just enjoy those snippets.
Sure.
Yes. Well, we have some snippets of a conversation today with Ira Matetsky, editor of the latest BSI Press Manuscript Series book. It's the manuscript of The Blanched Soldier. Ira's going to fill us in as to how that came about and this very different kind of story, and it's fascinating commentary. So we're looking forward to that. Meanwhile, if you would like to listen to the show ad-free, get bonus content, we do have options available for you. We are available on Patreon and Substack. We have links in the show notes to either of those, or both of those, I should say, where you can support the show for as little as $1 a month. And that gets you access to all of the archives and the ability, as I said, to listen ad-free. For our supporters, we do have bonus content in the form of Sherlockian News. We have a segment that we cover every month looking at various items that have come to our attention when we do hear of Sherlock Everywhere, and we do a little news program just for you. Of course, we also have bonus content, extra content, bloopers, etc., from time to time from various episodes. So you'll want to check that out. And whatever you do, make sure you're following us, whether you're a subscriber, a supporter, or what have you. Follow us on whatever podcast platform you choose and share it with other Sherlockians who you think might be interested in these goings-on. Since you are a listener of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, we can be fairly certain that you enjoy audio. And if you enjoy audio as it relates to Sherlock Holmes, then guess what? You are in luck. Our friends at MX Publishing have over 390 books that are available on Audible as part of the MX Publishing platform. And we here at I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere have a code to share with you that you can claim for 5 free audiobooks. All you have to do is follow the link in the show notes under our sponsorship section. Click on that link, and it'll take you to a form that you can fill out to claim your 5 titles. You can look through the full list of Audible titles from MX Publishing so you can see what you are getting. There are titles there like The Selected Cases of Dr. Watson by Martin Daly, narrated by Kevin Green. The Further Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes by Caden Cooper Miles, narrated by Luke Barton, who you may remember appeared here on an episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere. And The Recollections of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Hall, narrated by Michael Langan. Again, there are over 390 titles to choose from. Put in the 5 that you like in that form, and you will get an email describing what you need to do to claim your free codes. We hope you appreciate this free offer from MX Publishing, our longtime sponsor and friend of the program. Be sure to visit their entire website at mxpublishing.com. Ira Matetsky, BSI, is a New York City Sherlockian whose interests include, get ready for it, the publication and bibliographical history of the canon, canonical manuscripts, law in the canon, Sherlockian society history and traditions, and Doylean and Sherlockian poetry. His articles have appeared in the Baker Street Journal and other Sherlockian periodicals, and in 7 previous BSI Press books, including Upon the Turf, Horse Racing, and the Sherlockian Canon, which he co-edited. He received the BSI's Morley Montgomery Award in 2020 for his BSJ article, Another Sherlockian Myth Debunked, Time to Turn the Paget. He's a member of several science societies, including the Sons of the Copper Beeches, the Sherlockians of Baltimore, and the Six Napoleons. He's a regular contributor to and former canonical annotations editor of the Baker Street Almanac, and is a frequent presenter at Sherlockian conferences. He's practiced law in New York since 1987. Ira Matetsky, welcome back to I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Excellent. Well, we'll get past all the regular perfunctory stuff since everybody's already heard that from you. I am curious, as we open this latest BSI Manuscript book, That Ghastly Face, your introduction brings a little more light into the world of BSI manuscripts, and it starts with some postcards and letters from the mid-1940s. You want to set the stage for our listeners? Because I think it's a good background for the manuscript series in general.
Well, long before there was a BSI Press manuscript series, or before anyone had thought about preparing facsimiles of manuscripts, the first step was to know which of Arthur Conan Doyle's handwritten manuscripts had survived and where they were. Obviously, you can't have a manuscript series without manuscripts. And what I had discovered years before I had any connection with the manuscript series, I was doing some research at Lilly Library in Indiana, and this was before the BSI archives were moved to Indiana. I was doing some completely unrelated research, and I came across this correspondence in the papers of an old irregular named David Randall, who had received a letter inviting him to see if he could prepare a census of which manuscripts survived and where they were. This was originally a suggestion that Vincent Starrett had made to Edgar Smith, then the head of the BSI, and Edgar forwarded it to David Randall, who acted on it. And the first manuscript census, so to speak, appeared in the old series of the BSJ. And I had just made a copy of this postcard and this letter. I shared it with a couple of friends and forgotten about it. And then about 7 years later, it fell to me to write an introduction to this book. And before I said, thanked all the contributors and surveyed what was in the book, I said, this might be a good opportunity to share this little bit of background to the readers who are obviously interested in the history of what we know about manuscripts. And so a little extra bonus there.
Yeah, it's a terrific bonus. It does offer a lot of insight. And one of the things I wanted to ask you to talk about on that theme is why manuscripts. It occurs to me that among our listeners, we might have folks who are not, whose eyebrows don't go up when they say, oh boy, a Conan Doyle manuscript, because they haven't really thought about it. What the manuscript might show, why is examining the manuscript interesting, what you might learn from it. Can you talk a little bit about that, about just at a very high level, just the why of an attraction of manuscripts?
Sure. I think there's always an interest in how a well-beloved series of works get to be created and get to be published. And once we step away, however temporarily, from the convention that Dr. Watson wrote the manuscripts, and if someone wants to presume that these are Dr. Watson's hands and not Dr. Conan Doyle's hands, be my guest. How did these stories come to be written? They came out of a man's head and were written on paper and then were revised. Some manuscripts have a lot of handwritten changes visible as the thought process continues, whether it's characters' names or the plot goes down a blind alley, and so a few sentences are crossed out, or editorial changes are made in pencil on the draft. But you can see differences between even how the original story appeared and how it might have been changed slightly or otherwise before it was sent along to the Strand magazine. And then it evolved further into what became the version that appeared in the Strand, and then in the books published in the UK, what appeared in whoever the American publisher's version was. And so we can look for variations. It's always thrilling to hold in one's hand the actual original of the manuscript. Some of them are in libraries or archives. Others are held by, private collectors. A lot of us, this is a series that was around long before I became involved in organized Sherlockian activity, so I'm certainly not the only person who enjoys looking at this. The other thing that everyone notices, everyone who looks at one of these manuscripts comments on, is how clear and readable Arthur Conan Doyle's handwriting is. The punchline is always, especially for a doctor. But these manuscripts are clear. You could read the story by reading the manuscript. And then in addition, we provide a transcription. We provide notes that Phil Burgum prepares on differences between the manuscript as handwritten, the manuscript as revised, the manuscript that appeared, the story that appeared in England, the story that appeared in America. And there's always, or I should say always, there's often fodder for speculation about what changes were made, why they were made. So there's the manuscript itself as a collectible object, and there's tracing the manuscript into the final story.
Yeah, I'm convinced that Conan Doyle did not practice medicine because his handwriting was too good.
There's Peter Blau. Peter Blau did point out to the one, and this is true. The one area where Conan Doyle's handwriting is less than perfect is that his A tends to look like an O, and vice versa. And Peter did take that fact and provide an alternative explanation to a mystery about the blue carbuncle, but that's a little off color. Perhaps I shouldn't get into it.
We know where you're going with that. For those of you who didn't catch that inference, just look up Goose's Crop.
Goose's Crop, yes. Say, Ira, go ahead.
I was just with that exception. The handwriting is very clear, and we have about half of the manuscripts for about half of the stories survive, and so we don't have all of them, but we try to work with all the ones we can find.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you to comment on, the number of extant manuscripts, and it's generally thought that it's really the last half, isn't it, of the cases of Sherlock Holmes that generally exist in manuscript, and it's the front half, if you want to look at it that way, that are less extant, missing.
That is absolutely correct to a first approximation. The leading scholars on the manuscripts and where they are, and not just where they are, but where they've been and the provenance of them, are Peter Blau and Randall Stock. In particular, Randall's Best of Sherlock website has the census of all the manuscripts that we know to exist today. And Randall, of course, writes an essay about the provenance and the form of each manuscript, including in this current book. Roughly, as you say, about the general rule is that everything that was written after the great hiatus, the manuscripts typically survive because Conan Doyle by that point knew that they were collectible and insisted that they'd be returned to him, and sold them or donated them or auctioned them for charity or did whatever he did with them. There are a couple of exceptions. We don't have Bruce Partington. We don't have Wisteria Lodge. And from your episode 6 or 7 years ago, when you talked about the book Trenches, which covered his last bow, we only have about half the pages there. But those are the only exceptions. Pretty much everything in the return, the case book, his last bow, the Valley of Fear, all those manuscripts survive. Conversely, pre the hiatus, very little survives. Sign of Four does because it was preserved in the Lippincott files. A Scandal in Bohemia is around. The Greek Interpreter is around. The Speckled Band is supposed to be around, although no one knows exactly where it is. It's somewhere in Greater Chicago, but if anyone knows where it is, please let Peter or Randall and me know.
Check the ventilator.
And then of course the Hound of the Baskervilles is a special case with some of the pages surviving, as most of your listeners probably know. That manuscript was dispersed and used as a promotion. Pages were put in the windows of bookstores with an advertisement, Sherlock Holmes is back. And so some of the pages survived, but many did not.
Yeah, that's the saddest one, I think. So this manuscript in particular is different than most. It is one of the two that is written by Holmes himself. Well, not the manuscript, but the story. And Conan Doyle took great care to have this manuscript bound. This was toward the end of his career. This was one of the last stories. And it appeared in a different magazine than we are typically used to hearing Sherlock Holmes appearing in. And yet, I think 5 stories appeared in Liberty magazine. You want to talk a little bit about Liberty and its impact?
Yeah, I think you've made 2 important observations there. One is that from, within the canon, this is one of only 4 stories that wasn't written by Dr. Watson, one of only 2 stories that wasn't written that was written by Sherlock Holmes himself. In terms of the the publication history. The last 6 Sherlock Holmes stories appeared in Liberty, which was an American general interest magazine comparable to a few of the other large magazines of the day. There's a line that I quote in my introduction from one of the Marx Brothers films. I think it might have been The Coconuts, where Groucho Marx says, "There's nothing like liberty except Collier's and the Saturday Evening Post." But Conan Doyle, as we all know, had said about 6 times, "I am done with Sherlock Holmes. I don't want to write any more Sherlock Holmes stories," but kept returning to the character. And in 1926, probably to raise funds for his spiritualist interests, he agreed to write 6 stories, which appeared in the UK in the Strand magazine, like everything else, and in the US in Liberty, which was a relatively new magazine. It had been started in 1924 by the proprietors of the Chicago Tribune. And the conventional wisdom has always been that Conan Doyle, must have been fairly desperate for money to have agreed to write 6 more stories, and 6 stories which, by general consent, are not all necessarily at the tip top of the quality rankings for the Holmes stories. I recently came across in some papers at the Library of Congress some evidence that Conan Doyle had actually signed a contract back in 1922 for another Sherlock Holmes book, for which at that time he'd only had 2 stories written. And so he must have contemplated writing more even as early as that. And of course, these 6 stories, along with 6 earlier stories from the 20s, wound up in the casebook of Sherlock Holmes, the last of the books.
Now, one of the things that we associate with these later stories in particular, certainly from the return on, is the wonderful illustrations by Frederick Dorr Steele. And Bert, I'm going to turn my attention to you because you are our resident Frederick Dorr Steele expert. However, it wasn't just Steele that illustrated this story. There's another artist by the name of Howard Elcock who provided some lovely illustrations. And you do Elcock justice by going beyond just this story. What can you tell us about this fascinating illustrator?
Well, his life was fascinating. When I was asked to write about Elcock, I knew very little other than what, like most readers, other than what I had seen in terms of his illustrations. And the joy of doing this kind of writing and this kind of essay, and it's nice that we've got time to do it because the process here, it takes some months to pull all these things together, involves a lot of research, and many of us just find that highly enjoyable, digging around and learning. So you go from knowing virtually nothing except the name at the bottom of an illustration to finding out about his life. Well, the short summary is that it turns out he was born in an artistic family in Glasgow. And this was at a time of revolution in art, sort of the start of Art Nouveau. His father was a key figure in a glass company that produced Clutha glass, which was very innovative. It's held in many museums, and it precursed, really, the substance, the line, the color, the shapes of Art Nouveau. And his mother, it turns out, was part of a very artistic family. She'd gone to the Glasgow School of Art, and as he matured, he followed her footsteps into the Glasgow School, went to London in the 1920s, began to get some commissions because of his work, including a magician's manual. Turned out to be a lovely story. He was retained by a fellow who published an annual survey, a huge book about magic, a guy named Goldston, and produced some amazing illustrations and cartoons. And he went on to become a very, very popular illustrator, as it turns out, in the 1920s in England, for many publications, including The Bystander, which sent him to all sorts of exotic locations. St. Moritz, Cannes, the resorts, where he did amazing paintings of Monte Carlo and the scenes. He had a great palette, very exciting colors. He also did posters for automobile publications and adopted and mirrored a palette that had been used for wonderful scenes, evocative scenes of the English countryside. And then he traveled a great deal in his life, and along the way, he developed some, one might say, his ego probably took over, and he developed some theories about color and art and life and health that gave him some interesting and eccentric experiences in his later years. He became an American citizen, and that's. I'm not doing justice to the story because I would like people to read the essay. It's really quite remarkable. He became apparently at one point a faith healer. He developed systems that were used by interior decorators and designers. He also thought for a while that he could classify personality based on artistic shapes and so on. And he led, I would say, quite a remarkable life.
When we decided, it was Bob Katz, who was the co-publisher at BSI Press at the time. Andy Solberg and John Bergquist play that role now. Bob invited me to edit this book, and we sat down and made a list of likely contributors, and we immediately focused on Bert as someone who could do justice to Elcock's career. The context is that while Frederick Dorr Steele illustrated this story and the other stories in Liberty Magazine, the UK, the Strand Magazine was always looking for illustrators. The iconic Holmes illustrator in the Strand, Sidney Paget, had died in 1908. And after that, there were a number of different British artists who did the illustrations for the Strand. Walter Paget, Sidney's brother, did one, and Harry Roundtree did one, and Ball and Tweidel and Holliday, and Howard Elcock illustrated 7 of the Sherlock Holmes stories in the Strand magazine, and yet relatively little is known by Sherlockians about him, which can no longer be said now that we have Bert's essay.
Yeah, it was really I thought, a well-done mini biography of Elcock, and the illustrations that you chose, Bert, to give us a sense as to Elcock's range, I think were quite compelling. Certainly the black and white illustrations, sketches that we see from the Sherlock Holmes stories, but then again, these wonderful pieces that you say were inspired by his travels to St. Moritz and Monaco and all the rest, and his automobile advertisements, and some of them here are in color. But I know you were working with quite a library of images, and you've generously volunteered to make those available to our Patreon and Substack listeners.
Oh, yes. I would love people to have an opportunity to see the actual art. And all of these things, it took a very long time to restore them because the scans and the copies that exist are challenging to work with. And particularly in his bystander illustrations, these were 2-page spreads. And so putting these things back together, balancing the colors, restoring the illustrations as best we can is always a bit of a challenge. And I love people to really see them. And, it's his imagination, the joy of this, and the reason why illustrators like Freddie Steele are so important, and Elcock, and Frank Wiles, who's another great Sherlock Holmes illustrator. the reason why this is important is that, the author sits down and imagines the scene, puts it on the page, the reader reads it, and it goes into the hands of an illustrator who's got to look at the text, is the first one to see the text other than the editor. So you get the illustrator, is the first one looking at it. And it's the illustrator who has to say, where are the moments of drama? And what's the process? How do I get this idea on the page? And how can I make a drawing with personality and atmosphere? And that's what characterizes the work of the great illustrators like Freddie Steele, but also Charles Addams and Walt Kelly and Al Hirschfeld. People who had this genius of putting these things on the page. And Elcock's stuff some of it is very comic and very dark, and he had a unique ability to capture the excitement of the 1920s in England, and it's just something to see some of these works brought back.
Yeah. Well, like we said, we will make those available with a link for our Patreon and Substack subscribers. Just check the show notes for that for more information and to get access yourself. Ira, besides the physical manuscript itself, the physical illustrations that we have to look at, there are, of course, some wonderful essays and analyses included in that ghastly face. And I was pleasantly surprised to see just what a range of topics they were. Can you maybe highlight some of them, maybe some that stood out to you or grabbed your attention as you were editing?
Happy to do that. We've already mentioned the transcription and notes from Phil Burgum, which are a regular feature, followed by Randall Stock's essay about the history of the story and the manuscript, and my piece on Liberty Magazine, and Bert's article about Howard Elcock. Two questions that Sherlockians always ask about a Sherlock Holmes story is when it took place, the chronology aspect, and where it took place, the geography aspect. And so we have a piece by Cadman Cook trying to locate Tewkesbury Old Park and Tewkesbury Hall, where the action of the Blanched Soldier took place. I think she pins it down well. As I said in the introduction, she did a hell of a job with it. The Blanched Soldier is not a difficult story chronologically. The narrator indicates the date on which the events took place, and unlike many of the other stories, that date actually works. So don't have a lot of speculation about what year the story took place in. So, but the chronologically interesting thing about this story is the reference to Dr. Watson's second wife, and Bruce Harris, a well-known chronologist and also one of the newest class of irregulars as of a couple of weeks ago. So congratulations to Bruce. Writes his theory, shares his theory about who the second Mrs. Watson was, a theory that I won't spoil here, but suffice it to say that I was not and never will be prepared. We then move on to, Bert, I think you mentioned earlier that this is one of only two stories that Holmes is the narrator of, and so Andy Solberg has a piece about Sherlock Holmes's performance as the narrator, and was he in fact the narrator? We then change gears a little bit, and we move to the background of the story. The eminent British Sherlockian and Doylean Paul Chapman has a chapter about Arthur Conan Doyle and the Boer War, which of course is the background for this story. Dr. Marilyn McKay, who's a dermatologist, as well as a Sherlockian, writes about dermatology and Sherlock Holmes, obviously a key focus of this story. Mary Alcaro, whose academic specialties include plague literature, gave a talk a few years ago at the Sons of the Copper Beeches about whether the leprosy referred to throughout the adventure of the Blanched Soldier was actually, leprosy at the time was a devastating disease, but she speculated on whether it might be code for something even darker. And so she's adapted that into an excellent chapter in this book. Monica Schmidt, who is a therapist and medical health professional, writes one of her chapters about psychopathology in the canon. The joke with Monica is that anytime she reads a story, she will diagnose the characters, and anytime she's in a room with some of us, she will diagnose the Sherlockians. And so she writes about Godfrey Emsworth's mental health issues, in addition to his physical issues, speculating about whether he had what today we would call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or some other medical illnesses. We're winding up shortly. Jim Webb accepted our invitation to write about the whole casebook and the question of whether these stories are real. People have speculated that some of the stories in the casebook, some of the less highly regarded stories, might not actually be true and authentic canonical accounts. As horrible it is that might be to contemplate, so Jim speculates on that. Shana Carter, who I might mention, is another of the newest class of Baker Street Irregulars, so congratulations also to Shana. Writes about Shana has an interest, in addition to being a Sherlockian, in horror and those types of stories, and she writes about uncanny elements, some extraordinary nightmare. And finally, another eminent British Sherlockian and Doylean, Mark Jones, known to many for his podcast and as the new editor of the Sherlock Holmes Journal from the London Society, writes about Conan Doyle's other non-Sherlockian short stories after World War I, in addition to writing the 12 stories of the casebook, as well as his nonfiction spiritualist publications and about the war. Doyle wrote several other interesting works of fiction throughout the 1920s, and so Mark winds up the book with a fairly thorough discussion of those. So we start with The Blanched Soldier, and people would say, The Blanched Soldier is not my favorite story. How can you spin a whole book out of it? But when you take inspiration from it, and when you branch out in every direction, there's plenty of material to work with. And if it's possible for The Blanched Soldier, I would suggest that it's possible for any of the 60 stories.
Ira, what was the biggest surprise for you as you spent more time with this book?
Nothing is immediately coming to mind. I think the biggest surprise was a few years ago was finding that we actually could get the manuscript to publish. For many years, the New York Public Library, which is where this story is located, along with a couple of the others, was not willing to share the facsimiles of the stories for whatever reason. And then one day I discovered, and I talked about this on a previous episode of this podcast when I was on with Ross and we were discussing the Norwood Builder book. One day the librarian assured me that had changed, and we were able to get copies of the manuscript of the Norwood Builder and the Devil's Foot. And this one had to wait a little while because it was still under copyright. But a couple of years later, they shared this one, which of course made these volumes possible. And this book is titled, all the books are titled after a line in the story. So that ghastly face is a quotation from the story when the face is seen through the window. But I had originally proposed a title based on the last line of the story, which would also describe my reaction when the library agreed to copy all these for us. That joyous shock.
That's great. Well, I remember an email exchange with you last year. I gave you maybe a dozen different selections of phrases from the story. And you had an embarrassment of riches to choose from as far as book titles go.
Yeah, my initial, bearing in mind again that this is one of the few pieces for one of the two cases that Holmes writes. He just says at the beginning, Dr. Watson has always suggested that I write up an experience of my own. And I had proposed an experience of my own as a possible title for the book, emphasizing the Holmesian narration. It was pointed out that probably wasn't specific enough. We went with another title, which I'm very happy with. But I recycled that and used it as the title for my introduction, because although I've contributed to a few of these books, this was my first time I got to edit one. And so I had an enormously fun time wading through and enjoying this experience of my own.
Yeah. Well, I think the work product is certainly exemplary of that. And we would encourage everyone to go to the BSI website and check out under the BSI books section the table of contents and ordering information for that ghastly face. I think, Ira, you've done an admirable job of running through the contents here without giving away too much. And to me, it's just as you said, the book itself of the manuscript is probably better than the story itself. And I think that it stands as a testament to your leadership and bringing together this wonderful team of writers, creators, analysts, and Sherlockians all to contribute to this.
Well, let me also just thank, in addition to the contributors, I've mentioned Bob Katz, who initially invited me to edit the book, Andy Solberg and John Bergquist, who are the co-publishers, who saw it through with me. Andy Fusco is the series editor for the manuscript series and has been for a long time. And ultimately, credit for the manuscript series goes to Michael Keane and Les Klinger, who helped get it started.
It's a wonderful series, and we are all the better for all of them being involved, and certainly for you. So thanks again, Ira, for joining us here on I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere.
Happy to be here.
It was a great experience talking with Ira about the book. It was a great experience working with him as an editor. And it's interesting when you think about his description of the contents, how lucky this community is to have people of such specialties, such that when you come up with an editorial agenda for a book like this, you can assign these things to people who have the experience and the knowledge, and who can really bring something to it by putting their professional expertise into it. And I'm very pleased to be part of this. It's a great project. I was just very pleased to make a contribution to it.
Yeah, well, it shows. It really shows. And I think the level of professionalism and expertise is deep here. And I was, again, very pleasantly surprised at what I found for a story that to me is lackluster, or at least not as one of the interesting stories in the canon. I mean, if you're going to take the two stories that Sherlock Holmes wrote, The Lion's Mane and The Blanched Soldier, The Lion's Mane all day long, no question. So this was just chock full of insights and bits of information that I don't think we had before. I mean, even to understand the pay that Conan Doyle got for submitting this manuscript to Liberty Magazine, and how they paid him per word, and the translation to current day funds, how much he would have been paid in total from both the UK and the US rights. Fantastic information, right? Things that I don't think we really spend a lot of time thinking about.
Yeah, very true.
It's A Chance of Listening with your correspondent, Madeline Quinones.
Hello, everyone. I'm Madeline Quinones, and today I'm here to talk about the Watsonian Weekly. The Watsonian Weekly is the John H. Watson Society's look at your week just past and your week ahead. Like John H. Watson, we might get a few dates wrong, we might misplace our war wound, but if you're into Watson, his writings, and random possibly connected bits, here's a whole lot of Watson for you. Okay, I couldn't do better to introduce you to the show than to give you the basic version of the intro itself. Brad Kefauver has been running this show weekly ever since May of 2019. Also, it is the official podcast of the John H. Watson Society, which is independent, online, and international. Brad doesn't do it alone, however. There have been a multitude of segments over the years featuring a variety of bullpups, or society members, including Rob Nunn, Paul Thomas Miller, Margie Deck, Sandy Kozin, Heather Henson, and me. And now I'm realizing that I've been a correspondent with the show for 4 years. Holy cow. Okay. The show also regularly features the voices of other members and non-members alike because the monthly meetings on Zoom are usually recorded. It's a nice way to catch up if you've missed a meeting or to relive a fun time. The Watsonian Weekly is a show that is always evolving. After all, it's focused on Watson, who doesn't exactly make himself the most present first-person narrator in history, and thus doesn't make it easy on us. Segments have included Words of the Week, Watsons of the Week, Book Buying, Bees, Hats, Interviews, and Clark Russell's Fine Sea Stories, which, spoiler alert, are actually really weird. Brad also sometimes records at conferences and at 221BCon for a little extra fun and flavor. But what has currently taken over the Watsonian Weekly is the Bullpups and Company segment, where Brad, Heather, and I talk about the latest episode of the Sherlock & Co. podcast. Yes, I do a lot of podcasting about other podcasts. So, recommendations. For a meeting recording, I'm going to go with September 30th, 2024, when several Bullpups had to cast their ideal Hound of the Baskervilles movie. For an event recording, April 17th, 2023. Shenanigans at 221BCon that might revolve around asking too much of a sleep-deprived Paul Thomas Miller. Sorry, Paul. As for the rest, I don't know. It's a big podcast at this point, and most episodes don't exactly have themes. The older episodes are shorter, if you're curious enough to start from the beginning. Once we started reviewing Sherlock & Co. is when they get long regularly, but even then, it's only around an hour per episode. And that's, well, not it, but that's all we got time for. Catch you later.
Somebody is having way too much fun. And it's us.
Oh,
because
hooray!
we're the beneficiaries of all of this. I don't think we could have picked a better person than Madeline to be our correspondent. She clearly loves to podcast about podcasts of Sherlock Holmes. How very meta. Well, you may remember that a couple of episodes ago, we replaced the Sherlockian news segment with the Learned Societies, which is a look at goings-on in the world of Sherlock Holmes societies. We may refer to them as science societies, which is an official designation that the group has been recognized by the BSI, but it's all immaterial at this point. We just want to let you know where you can find information about goings-on, perhaps in your community, and some highlights that we see going on from the Sherlockian calendar. So why don't we start there at sherlockiancalendar.com. This is something that is managed by Ron Fish, a recent investitured member of the Baker Street Irregulars. And if you have an event locally that is going on and you would like Ron to put it on the calendar, all you have to do is reach out to him via the link there, and he will add it to the feed. So what do we see that's up and coming in the next month or so, Bert?
Well, in the next month, there's a lot of things happening between now and the end of the month of February, including some things happening today, February 15, which, as you're listening to this, you've probably missed the Norwegian Explorers Study Group and the Nashville Scholars of the Three Prime Problems luncheon meeting. But you've got hopes for the future, I suppose. And then later in the month, tomorrow in Australia, the Sherlock Holmes Society of South Australia is having an afternoon tea.
That's actually today in Australia.
Oh, that's right. It's today. Well, you missed that too, folks.
Spoiler alert.
I'm sorry. And the Sound of the Baskervilles in Federal Way, Washington is having a luncheon meeting. And there are plenty more things going on. Watson's Tin Box of Ellicott City and Rochester Row is meeting. Also, the Harpooners of the Sea Unicorn.
That one is that's a virtual meeting. It's worth calling out. There are a number of these local groups that do virtual meetings that anybody can participate in, regardless of your geography. And Harpooners of the Sea Unicorn is one of those.
Yes, good point. And there are two more in the month of February. Bootmakers of Toronto have a virtual meeting on the 22nd, and the Afghanistan Perceivers have a virtual meeting on the 27th. And Denny Dobry's Mechanicsburg PA group, the White Rose Irregulars, meets on the 22nd in person, and also Paul Hartnett's Middlesex Constabulary meets in Monroe Township, New Jersey on the 26th. So February turns out to be a busy month for Sherlockians.
There's a lot to squeeze into a short month.
Yeah.
And of course, we round the calendar. We flip the page into March, and we've got 5 Miles from Anywhere, which is out in Colorado, I believe, but that's a virtual meeting as well. You can check that on their Facebook page. Steve Mason running the crew of the Bark Lone Star. He is one of the faces and movers and shakers behind the Legion of Zoom. You may have heard us do an episode with the Legion of Zoom. Steve is running the crew of the Bark Lone Star virtual meetings as well. Also out in Denver, Dr. Watson's Neglected Patients is having its luncheon meeting on the 2nd. And, of course, the first Wednesday of every month in New York is traditionally known as Ash Wednesday, where the adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes gather. You can contact Shana Carter for more information about the March 5th Ash Wednesday. You can have dinner with the Tankerville Club in Cincinnati. Their Facebook page has information there. Goodness, we got the Parallel Case of St. Louis. They're having a meeting on the 8th. The Red Circle of Washington, D.C. is also having a meeting on the 8th, as well as the dinner meeting of the Dog Street Irregulars in Williamsburg, Virginia.
And plenty more things going on, in particular in Baltimore. The Sherlockian Invitational Weekend is March 14 to 15, with a number of things going on. A dinner Friday, March 14th at 7 o'clock at the Maryland Club. The Sherlockians of Baltimore, also known as the SOBs, Sherlockians of Baltimore, have a luncheon meeting the next day on Saturday the 15th at 1 p.m., and then there's more. Let's see what else is going on. Saturday morning, the 15th, for those inclined, there's a breakfast meeting of the Sherlockians of Dubious Memory. And after the luncheon, the SOB's luncheon, there'll be a gathering of the Black Pearls of the Borgias, which is the Baltimore chapter of SPODE, Sherlockians Preventing Oysters Destroying the Earth. So all of this it's a big deal, and you can find out more by going to SherlockBaltimore.com.
Wow, that is a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Well, there are more goings-on in Michigan, Illinois, Tennessee, Minnesota, Washington State, and of course, Dayton, Ohio, with the big Dayton Conference coming up. You can check out all of the information about these events and more at SherlockianCalendar.com, and we'll have a link to that in the show notes. If you know of a Sherlockian meeting that's going on that we need to know about or that Ron needs to know about, just reach out to us at comment@ihearofsherlock.com. Well, those dulcet strains means that it's only one thing. It's time for the canonical couplet. That's right, it's everyone's favorite Sherlockian quiz program on the air, where we give you 2 lines of poetry and ask you to identify which Sherlock Holmes story we happen to be talking about. The last time we were here, we left you with this clue. The cigarettes were by Ionides. Holmes settled this one with the utmost ease. Bert, I should know better, but I'm still going to ask you, which story is this?
Oh, so many things go on in the cases of Sherlock Holmes in rooming houses. And Holmes, in this case, is confronted by or approached by a person who's rented a room to someone, but the person in the room never appears. Their face is always covered. Well, Holmes discovers it's actually someone who served 10 years in prison because of a jailed burglary that resulted in being put in the slammer. And that's the case Watson called The Adventure of the Jailed Codger. I like that. That's good.
No, that wasn't it. I know it's a shocker. Well, as usual, we turn to Eric Deckers to help us out of this jam. He says, I've got it. This is the story where Holmes is being targeted by the world's most extravagant assassin who kills his marks with a pistol made of precious metal, even as Holmes attempts to solve a murder. It's the story Watson called The Adventure of the Golden Gun. Except I think I confused it with a James Bond movie, which is an easy mistake to make. Instead, it's The Adventure of the Golden Pince-Nez. Yes, Eric, you did get it after all. The Golden Pince-Nez. Or if you are like 12-year-old Scott reading this story for the first time, The Adventure of the Golden Pince-Nez. Yes, well, we had quite a few entries this time around, a very healthy entry system here, and we're going to go ahead and give the prize wheel a big spin, try and figure out exactly who it is that we're going to award our prize to, and it looks like it is number 31. Oh, I like that. Lucky 31, and that means our winner is Philip Minden. Philip, congratulations. We will have a copy of Sherlock Holmes and the Empire Builders off to you once that is published. Well, this time around, we have a big prize. This is, yes, you guessed it, it is a copy of That Ghastly Face from the BSI Press. Very valuable entry in our prize vaults here, and it will be given to the person who solves this correctly and whose name we choose at random. The most flint-hearted reader utters yelps when told of what afflicted Tadpole Phelps. If you know the answer to this episode's canonical couplet, put it in an email addressed to comment@ihearofsherlock.com with canonical couplet in the subject line. If we select your name at random from all of the correct responses, you'll win. Good luck. Well, Bert, we've done it again.
Hooray!
Despite all predictions. Hard to believe.
It's amazing, isn't it?
I know. Well, we've got another episode coming up in short order because this is February, and that means our next episode will not drop on the 30th of the month because there is no 30th of the month.
Aww.
Should we drop it on March 2nd instead?
Sure, why not?
No, listeners, because you are so dedicated, this is the month where we give you content early. on February 28th. Who will we be talking to? Well, we'd love to tell you, but we don't even know yet. It's one of our biggest held secrets. In the meantime, you feel free to look over our show notes. Follow us on whatever platform you choose to listen to podcasts on. Could be YouTube, could be Spotify. Heck, you could even ask your smartphone speaker to play our latest episode. Wherever it is, we ask you to share it with other people and bring together this community of Sherlockians worldwide. Meanwhile, this is the extremely local Scott Monty.
And I am right next door. I'm Bert Wolder.
And together, we say, the games of foot.
Foot?
The games of foot.
You know, I'm afraid that in the pleasure of this conversation, I am neglecting business of importance, which awaits me elsewhere.
Thank you for listening. Please be sure to join us again for the next episode of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the first podcast dedicated to Sherlock Holmes.
Goodbye, and good luck, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes.